come to the 45th presentation in this year of the Parayana, the way across, the way beyond. We're used to hearing that the universe began in a fireball burst of a super hot plasma. The primordial dimension, though, of the universe is time. It's the first dimension. And time is spontaneous. It does not have time per se, but as soon as it has existence, time instantly then blossoms into space. So that space with its three dimensions, its blossoming, its branching off the stem of time, gives us the confidence phenomenally to characterize, finally, in the 20th century, the universe in terms of space-time. More accurate would be time-space. That time, as we have been discussing all year and previously in development, that time in nature, in the cycle of nature, which is universal, has a special double transform when it comes to the very high developments like civilization. And there's a triple time signature, time forms in civilization that come out of the first dimension of time, which is really the spontaneous appearance of energy. Space allows for matter integrated, but time is spontaneous. It's true that the phenomenality in space is instantaneous, but the energy of time is spontaneously. So that in terms of a space-time, there is an of time as a momentum, as a direction, as an arrow of time. And there is a past time, there is a future time that are mediated by a now, which is the present. And that now is always in motion, a vector of the direction of time. This is not true in reality. This is true in the sub-case of space-time. But when one looks at time as energy, it is the predominant primordiality of the way in which spontaneity, and that spontaneity takes precedence over the instantaneousness of matter, of phenomenon. It is the hidden root of existence. So that when one looks at the famous equation, E equals mc squared, the E being energy, equals the mass of phenomenality times multiplied by the speed of light squared. And the squared is an indication of space, of a frame of reference, of a two-dimensional computation of a motion, light squared. And later on, the caveat that comes into play significantly is that in terms of the stability of the motion of matter, of a time-space reckoning of the universe, not only is a linearity, an integral, a path integral of movement which has momentum, it accrues, but it also has a curving spiral quality, which we would call, and do call, angular momentum. And that angular momentum is characteristic of all matter, not only down to the atom, but subatomically. The proton at the nucleus of the atom has angular momentum. One of the most recent, this is November 5th, 2014, an internet article, Physicists' Narrow Search for Solution to Proton Spin Puzzle. That the proton will have, all protons, and thus neutrons as well, will have angular momentum due to this spin. So that the chirality of energy in terms of time is extremely important in order to understand reality and not merely appearance. It goes on to say that this experiment was on Long Island at the Brookhaven Heavy Ion Collider, the Relativistic Heavy Ion Collider, run by the Department of Energy, the DOE. The Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island is not very far from Walt Whitman's birthplace, from the Cold Spring Harbor Research Institute's buildings headed by James D. Watson. So it's a very interesting locale on Long Island. The experiments reveal insights of how quarks and gluons, the subatomic building blocks of protons, contribute to the proton's intrinsic angular momentum, a property more commonly known as spin. Not only do protons spin, but electrons spin, neutrons spin, all particality, and all of the integrals of atoms, molecules, minerals, metals, organic forms have an angular momentum, so that it becomes moot to realize that in very complex forms like a civilization, there is an angular momentum of immense subtlety, of great hidden invisibility, in terms of which we would understand things, of matter, of, in fact, the characterization of energy as a dimension subsumed by matter. That space-time subsumes then all of the four dimensions. There are qualities that are hidden, that come out into play, especially underlined and salient when you get to the complexity of civilizations, where there are triple time forms that have developed in a double transform, taking natural time and creating a transform so that it becomes a fifth dimension, not just the first, but the fifth dimension. In very ancient times, because the first identification, the first notice that this was actuality, not just a fact, but an actuality that needs to be brought into all considerations concerning ourselves not only in a deeper quality of nature, more realistic, more practical, more existential, but having a sense not just of a present moment as an arbiter between past and future, but a higher, deeper, wider realization that the present moment derives its existence from presence. And it is presence which is that quality out of which time itself occurs spontaneously. So that to have a presence is a quality of the divine. In ancient biblical understanding, there is a day when all beings present themselves to the presence of the divine, of God, of the Lord. And there is such a thing as an angel of the presence who helps the communication going on. One can find this, for instance, in the beginning of the book of Job. That presence goes through a second transform and becomes shareable. It is the shareability of presence that has the most incredible accrual of time, form, energy in the cosmos. The universe being a subset of the cosmos, not in terms of multiple universes, which is a misunderstanding. It's an illusory projection, but of there being more dimensions to a cosmos than there are to a universe. In fact, the Vajrayana, the diamond way, the diamond path, understands that while there are essential qualities to the way of the world, in Sanskrit it's called Rupayana, but there are 4 additional super essential qualities to another aspect of the world which is invisible, the spiritual quality of the world, and that realm, Arupayana. Rupa in Sanskrit means name. It's nameable. It has a form because it's been named. Arupayana, arupa, is that it has no nameability. That this is the realm of the divine, which has no name. So that one has this 4 plus 4, one has an 8 quality. That there is, in fact, as in Buddhism, 4 noble truths, but they have an angular momentum that blossoms into an 8-fold path. Murray Gell-Mann used that 8-fold quality to describe the first development of quarks, the realization, and he picked the name quark out of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. A quark is the very most minute, imaginable, unimaginable point. And in the relativistic heavy ion collider at Brookhaven National Lab, they found for the first time that gluons make a significant contribution to proton spin, and that they also generate, when they split, when they break, another epiphenomenon called sea quarks, SEA. That this is a discovery that the very gluons, the particality that holds the quarks together, glues them together, contribute to the spin of a proton, but that the summed total of the spin of the quarks and the gluons thus do not add up to enough to account for the actual measured spin of the proton, that there must be something else. And was it that the sea quarks then have some other capacity? And this is in November of 2014 at the beginning. And this is an investigation, the kind of which is characterized at this particular juncture in civilization, where we come to an advanced, more dynamic, with more accrued energy built up and accumulated, so that the penetrative quality of understanding is able to go into more and more realms that were before hidden, were invisible, were in fact not nameable, not measurable, because we have discovered that there are limits to identification, and that one does not only transcend identification, but that there is a double quality of not only transcending identification, but transcending the transcendence. This quality is realizing the presence and then realizing that the distillation of presence is a shared presence. And so our subtitle here for this last 13 presentations of the Parayana, our shared presence carrier wave. It is the carrier wave that is one of the time forms of civilization that comes into play because of language. It comes into play because language is able to be written. And when it is able to be written, the concomitant to that is that it is able to be read. When you read or write language, the natural capacity for languages, which is a part of the natural cycle. Animals have languages. There are languages of color. There are languages of smell. Plants, in that case, have languages themselves. Flowers have languages. Sri Aurobindo's companion, the mother, wrote a book on flowers and their meanings, and so forth. It's a quality where that presence that has come as like a fifth dimension into play, as a field which is coextensive with the very source field of nature. And that source field of nature, in terms of understanding presence, was already not measurable. So that in the realm of measurability, one characterizes that as zero. That zero field of nature is not a neutered zero field, but is fertile because time is able to spontaneously generate and instantly generate phenomenality. And that this is not a rare, but it is a distinguishing characteristic of the universe. Subatomic particles are constantly coming spontaneously into play and disappearing out of play. And this gives the quality in the appearance, measurability, the sense that there is a quantum, a quantifiable packet, a bundle, something that can be given a measurability called a quanta, but that part of the meaning, not just the written and thus read written language, but a deeper sense that there is also a deeper meaning to what one is reading, to what one is writing. And the most elementary quality that can be expressed is that this ability to read and write, so that it not only has that existential expressiveness of a language, but that it has further a deeper meaning to it. It's like an undercurrent of meaning that accompanies the very vocabulary, the very grammar, the very syntax, in the sense of the classic way 2,000 years ago was to characterize it, and was characterized as allegory. That there is a doubled meaning. There is a doubled meaning because one can understand what one is reading, because whoever was writing also understood that, so that there is a shareability in the reading and the writing of language that goes into this field which we can and do call consciousness, but is a differential consciousness. It is like the thumb on the hand. It is able to give a dexterity to the ability to have a manipulation of the techne of things, the technology, and also to have a firmer, better grasp, so that the hand becomes, very early on, 40,000 years ago, there are hands on Paleolithic art already, usually in red, and usually in two forms. There is the impress of the hand, and there is the hand that takes the colored liquid mulched with saliva in the mouth and blown on the hand so that it leaves a stencil. There is the imprint and there is the stencil. And that both qualities, the two-handedness, allows for a second transform to occur. A third quality of time comes into play. The first quality of time is definitely the way in which the carrier of civilization is language. The second is that there is the time aspect, that there is a meaningfulness of it in terms of a visionary field, and that this meaningfulness of it then is an addition, which is not just an adding, but is itself a multiplication. Because that fifth dimension can transform all four individually of the phases of a natural cycle, that rupa yana that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, so that the arupa yana, the meaning of it, is able to come into play in at least 4 different ways, but also a 5th way in that it can transform the entire cycle. And when it transforms the entire cycle, all of the transformed phases of a natural cycle, that 4-ness, that quaternary quality of a completed circle, comes into play with a very special transform, which was not a part of the circle, but was the entire interior of the circularity. And that entire interior of the circle is not just a center, not a center point, but is the central space, which is not different from the context space without the circle, so that the circle is seen as something which is an appearance on the field, in the field, on the context within the field of at least a 5-dimensional continuum. And that this adds then a particular quality which will again be given a second transform, so that instead of there just being a carrier wave with the undertone of an accumulated meaning, the best word for that would be, in terms of the carrier wave, a reference wave, to give it a meaningful, a measurable, a quality of expressible exactness of what this is, its phenomenality, its existentiality, its organicality, its civilized, human, in our case, meaning. That second transform, that third quality of time, is the prismatic person or persons who are participating in that shared presencing. That shared presence, those persons have, like the chirality of the spin of the proton, a quality of being able to be translated also into the universe in terms of a technology. Just as the polarity of electron and proton allow for us to have the positive and negative scalar for electromagnetic energy, and one then can have electronics out of this, like computers, appliances, lights, whatever. There is a deeper, more pervasive symmetry that is there in terms of the chirality of the magnetic complement of electromagnetism, which is not electric in terms of electronics, but is guaranteed by the spin, by the chirality, that electrons, in addition to being negative charged, have a spin. They have an angular momentum. Protons, not just a positive, the positive particle, but they have a spin as well, each and every one. And that those spins, that spintronics is now actual in the 21st century, a great development of spintronics, to complement, not just to add to electronics, but to multiply. One has to be aware that when you get into transformative dimensions, a multiplication happens, not just an addition. An addition is an integral quality, whereas a multiplication is a differential quality. So that visionary field of differential quality, that consciousness, that differential consciousness, able to transform not just the four phases of the Rupayana, of the phenomenality of the natural integral cycle, wherever it occurs in the universe, and in the universe considered as a whole. There's an angular momentum that also has a realization that it is not just a one-way spin, chirality, but that chirality comes in a pair. And it is the paired chirality that jumps the scalar from the emphasis in the electromagnetic spectrum on the magnetic to the magnetoelectric spectrum, which is much more powerful than the electromagnetic spectrum, in which one can discern that there is an electric application quality to the magnetoelectric scalar. But its overall characteristic is that of that second transform. And the second transform, like the first transform, going to the ability to have a vision, fifth dimension, which has the quality then among other aspects to it, but salient among those other aspects is a quality of presence that becomes shareable. And when it becomes shareable, it's not just communicable, but is a deeper, higher, wider, shareable. And that tunability of the shareability of presence in the magnetoelectric spectrum gives rise to a cosmos. This has a reflection, especially in the 20th century, and one of the signal years for that is 1927. In 1927, for instance, this is a quotation from a book by Buckminster Fuller, Ideas and Integrities, a spontaneous autobiographical disclosure. This came out in 1963. I bought my copy in San Francisco on Market Street. There was a big technical bookstore called Stacy's. And I was working for Metropolitan Life head office and making a lot of money at the time for somebody just 22 years old, and was busy buying books. I had so much money, I didn't know what to do with it. No girlfriend, no car, buy books. Here's the quotation from Fuller. This is in chapter 18, Continuous Man. In 1927, I published my conviction that 2 billion new era premium technology dwelling devices would be needed within this century, requiring a whole new world-encompassing service industry. I predicted that it would take a quarter of a century to establish that new industry. In 1952, right on time, right on theoretical schedule, the Ford Motor Company was the first purchaser of any geodesic domes, which were prototypes of the new era premium technology structures. 10 years later, 1962, I was able to count over 2,000 of my structures in 40 countries. 1927, and in 10 years, planetary, planet-wide, not just worldwide, but planet-wide, because when one has a fifth dimension of differential consciousness, this is not just a world, a realm in which we are subsumed, live and reproduce and eat and have our being. but it is a planet in a larger world. And the larger world immediately, traditionally, includes the moon. Now, because this is a planet, it's not just Earth, it's Terra. It's not just the moon, it's this moon, Luna. And the concomitant are the moving other planets, the stars that not only move, but have their motion, which is orbital. And as Kepler discovered some 400 years ago, those chiralities do not have to be in perfect circle spirals, chirally, but can be in ellipses. And the complexity of elliptical orbits allows for one to have eventually a celestial mechanics that shows that it isn't just a planetary as opposed to a world scalar, but a whole star system, a stellar system. And the realization that all of the other points of light in the universe are stellar systems as well, whether with or without planets and who knows what. And that some stars work together as binaries, some in triples, some even in quadruples. Our nearest star, Alpha Centauri, actually is a pair of pairs, 4 stars that work together. The other two, other than Alpha and Beta, are very small. Nevertheless, they are there. So our first interstellar step will be to a quadruple, a quaternary star system. About another 70 years. This quality of understanding in someone like a Buckminster Fuller was realized because there was a powerful idea which he called tensegrity, the distribution of force in a geodesic dome. Let's take a little break and we'll come right back to this. Let's come back to our consideration becoming a reconsideration, becoming a triple consideration. We ended the first half bringing into play an architect like Buckminster Fuller, whose geodesic domes proliferated and came into play in such a way that it was important to be able to understand Fuller, who's speaking personal language and writing personal language was extremely dense in the sense that we were unused to it. Unused to his syntax, his vocabulary, his momentum, which was not only a momentum but had a recursive quality of redoing and transforming as it went along, informing Ideas and Integrities, that was published in 1962, came as not only was Ford Motor Company building the first geodesic dome, but a whole architectural community had a front row seat on the Ford Motor Company because they were the first really big patrons of a father firm that was based in Cranbrook, Michigan. Cranbrook is outside of Detroit, about 30 miles, 40 miles, up towards Flint. And at the Cranbrook Academy, a Finnish architect had moved his family to found the art and architecture department there, and his name was Alil Saarinen, and his son, who was just maturing, Eero Saarinen, were active at the Cranbrook Academy, and the prize young was Charles Eames, who was just meeting his future wife and shared presence companion, Ray Eames. And the confluence of Eames and Saarinen, the Eameses and Saarinens, gave rise in the 1940s to that came into play architecturally first in terms of furniture, in terms of the comforture of the human body in its repose, in its seatedness. And one of the first developments in the early 1940s was the chair, largely known by the way in which it was the ergonomic design, the geodesic architecture of the way in which we sit, which we take our seat, which we bring our rest into a working play for reading and writing in particular, for creating. The quality in Buckminster Fuller, by shifting from measurement to geodesics, it's not a measurable dome, it's a geodesic dome. So that cosmology began to reflect then the language that one's scalar was no longer on a decimal system or on an Arabic system and so forth. It was in terms of a geodesic. He wrote in chapter 18 on continuous man, a prelude in chapter 17, the future. And this is what he wrote in, actually it was 1961 that he wrote this. All mature people are now aware of the constantly accelerating rate of evolutionary transformation engulfing all humanity, which by the early 1960s was salient because the sensitivity to it, the sensibility, as Jane Austen would say, for this, towards this, was accelerated in the 1950s, which came as a harvesting of the 1940s. All of this was a part of a large series of waves of preparatory realizations leading to a culmination at the beginning of the 1990s, 1991 to be specific, of a new carrier wave, a whole new way of giving a time form to civilization on this planet in this star system, such that the door leading out of one's home would lead to interstellar space, which is upon us not only in interstellar space, but in the forerunning preludes is already beyond even intergalactic space. As we prepare to record voyagers entering into interstellar space, we are actually building telescopes instruments, technological access to a visionary field that includes not just the universe, but a cosmos of many dimensions, specifically of 11 dimensions, where the 4 dimensions of natural cycle, the Rupayana in ancient Sanskrit, and the Arupayana, the unnameable but spiritual dimensions of consciousness, those 8, that noble quality of the noble truths being put into practice with the 8-fold plan, 8-fold process, that then gives rise to a 12 quality of a completeness that has a resonance that carries beyond itself into a differential infinity. So that that 5th dimension of a visionary field becomes recognizable as an infinite field, and is coextensive, shares presence with the natural field, which has a zero-ness in terms of calibration, but a zero-ness that has a symmetry where the positives and the negatives have symmetricality around the horizon of zero-ness, which is not just a line, but one can graph it, one can give it electronic measurement as the frequency of energy in terms of a sine wave of various intensities around a median horizon that is not drawn, but is there because one understands that the symmetry is symmetrical around this horizon, and that by realizing that there is a positive and negative, and above the horizon, or below the horizon, that has a symmetricality, the momentum has an angular momentum of paired helical qualities that emphasize the magnetic in the electromagnetic and are capable of a further transform, a distillation, a refinement to a magnetoelectric scalar. It is this quality of the 4 plus 4 that gives a classic ninth. One of the most salient documents made in world civilization was the collection of the transcript of presentations given by Plotinus in his famous villa in Rome, teaching not just to a number of interested persons, but including the Emperor Aurelius and his wife. Women were always a part, not just an equal, but they were a dynamic, symmetrical part of the way in which Plotinus worked and understood. And his transcripts were edited into a series of Aeneads, 9 presentations as a group, and then 6 groups. So that those 6 times 9, those 54 treatises of Plotinus actually are a hexagon, which is a very stable structure. It is a stable geodesic of not just a circularity, but of a sphere. The honeycomb of bees is a hexagonal shape. The I Ching has hexagram shape. of a pair of trigrams. So that the triplicality, when shared, gives this 6-part structure to a 9-phase differential set. And that 9th dimension is very famous in an esoteric Alexandrian writing from about the 90s AD, the Hermetica, one that was lost for about 1700 years, conveniently lost. Its title is The 8th Reveals the 9th. And salient in that, translated, one finds attentively that the 8th reveals the 9th comes to a discovery towards its culmination, not the end, but the culmination of the penetrative dynamic of a time dimension being not only differentially conscious, but kaleidoscopically conscious as well. That those achieving life in a 9-dimensional cosmos hear the singing of those in the 10th. That 10th dimension has a choir, a choral communication. It is the sound, the hearing. Hearing is much more primordial than seeing. The vibration of the sound was there at the very genesis of phenomenal matter. The sight came later when the gluon quark plasma began to integrate itself into discrete stars and bodies and so forth. And then there was light. Then there were photons carrying the electromagnetic energy. But hearing was there primordially. A sound so deep that when it was first detected in 1966, it was thought to be some kind of imposition, some kind of an accident. It is the sound that is there by what was characterized then as the Big Bang. It's the echo of the Big Bang in the universe. But the Sanskrit word for that primordial sound is sphota, by the way, S-P-H-O-T-A. Here is a selection of a couple of sentences from Buckminster Fuller's Ideas and Integrities. The resultants of forces of all these net frustrated molecular actions are angularly outward of the balloon's geometrical center. Each surface molecule of the interior group of pressurized gas has a vectorial action and reaction pattern identically to a spherical chord. The chord is an index of sound, primordially. When you sound all of the notes in a scalar, that's a chord. A meeting together on a really deep level is not just a meeting, but it's an accord. This, as we talked about just before the break, Buckminster Fuller called tensegrity. It is not only the push outward, it is the pull of going inward that are balanced in a geodesic structure, like a geodesic sphere. The tension is distributed around the entire sphere so that whatever is impressing pressure-wise on it is symmetrical to the tension, strength, pressing out, and one has this equilibrium, not just in a sphere, but in, say, a dome, which is a conic section of a sphere. One of the great advances in math in Alexandria, about the time of Plotinus, was that light was understood intuitively to have a cone, not just a dissipative cone, but a differential movement of a cone, and one could take cross sections, conic sections of that cone, and do a whole new style of differential geometry. Available for the first time because one had made the step to a trigonometry. That one could understand that the momentum, the movement of a line is not just a line, but that it may have a beginning, but it has a direction, like that arrow of time, which is not a line, it's not a linearity, but it's a vector. And that vectors, when they're brought into pairedness, create the ability, centuries, almost millennia later, to develop a mathematics of a tensor, which is what Einstein used. And that now one can be able to understand that when Buckminster Fuller uses the term tensegrity, he's using a very sophisticated understanding of a double transform of structure. And in fact, about the same time that Fuller was coming up with tensegrity, the architect Frank Lloyd Wright was coming up with tenuity. And just as Fuller came up with the continuous, Frank Lloyd Wright came up with continuity. For Wright, the experience of an architecture is to explore its continuity and to understand its tenuity. That the structure is not just integral, but it is also differentially conscious at the same time, so that you have what one might clumsily call in the 1920s as a super tensegrity, a super geodesic. Frank Lloyd Wright simply called it organic. It's an organic architecture. One of the great examples of Wright's continuity and tenuity is the Marin County Civic Center in California, north of San Francisco. Completed after his death, and he lived to be in the early 90s. If you just look at the building, if you take a photo or photos of the building, if you stand in the building, it has kind of an odd tone to it, kind of like a cartoonish future, semi-science fictional doodaddy quality. But when you walk through it, the pace of walking, the human pace of walking with the entire continuity and tenuity of the Marin County Civic Center comes into play. And one gets, Wright called architecture frozen music. You get the full choir of the sight become the sound of the structure. And the entire architecture comes with your walking, with your pacing, with your time calibration of movement. And this is the pace of history. That history has a tensegrity and a tenuity, which becomes analytical, not only recursively in an aesthetic, but in the development and advancement of a science. Because science moves by the exploration of the way in which that new theoria from the field of vision, constellated by the artists of prismatic, six-dimensional conscious time-space, seventh dimension, naturally, supernaturally, in the same kind of double chirality, becomes an eight-dimensional scientific phase of civilization anywhere in the universe, but specifically as the gateway anywhere in the universe to a ninth dimension of that, in that 10th hyperspace dimensionality. Interstellar civilizations have their life being in movement. Sourced not in the past alone, but in the future as well, because the future of a 10th dimensional hyperspace cosmic universe is an 11th dimension of fertility to the zero field. Mother Nature, spontaneously, continuously, in tenuity, gives birth on the level where the existential and the organic are real. This quality comes into play because a third time form registry to the carrier wave and the reference wave is like an overtone to music. Like the reference wave is the undertone, the overtone is the prismatic person in kaleidoscopic historical dimension creating, which will be that quality that we come to recognize then as a kind of a pilot wave. That word was also pioneered in 1927 at the Solvay conference in Brussels. All the world's great physicists and cosmologists brought together, especially in that 1927 meeting. And one of the attendees, Louis, I used to pronounce it de Broglie, it's de Broglie, Prince Louis de Broglie, had pioneered the development of the expanded idea of the pilot wave, of taking the phenomenon of the soliton in physics, a wave that does not diminish, that does not lose its energy, because its energy carries in the time sense. And that carrier wave and that reference wave that is similar to it has a third wave that makes a patterning of the two into the momentum, the angular momentum of the carrier wave and the reference wave, and that is the pilot wave persons. When we are teaching here, the graphing of the frequency of that horizontal S-shaped curve of the way in which a time frequency energy of civilization, a time form of civilization, occurs. The first movement is from the horizon, the zero horizon, the invisible horizon of time's momentum into the angular momentum of its development, is to explore below the horizon and to find a trough, as one would describe it, in terms of graphing that energy frequency. And that trough has an exploration of the limits of the possibilities of that particular frequency. Greater frequency, deeper trough. Which has a turning point. Actually, the Greek term for that in very high Dharma philosophy is metanoia. One finds it originally in Pythagoras. One finds it characteristically used brilliantly by Plato. There is a turning point in structure where the ascent begins to achieve its symmetrical balance with the plummet descent into that quality of the energy frequency, and having found that it curves then in its complement back up. And that ascent re-achieves that horizon so that one has a cup-shaped dip. And the point of the carrier wave is revisiting that horizon equilibrium, but with the experience of the trough, as it were, and that midpoint is the millennium. And the apex of the trough is what anciently at that time, when it was first achieved consciously, it was called the via negativa, and rises above that horizon of the millennium, equally far above the horizon, that zero horizon that the trough was below, and that crest of that rising above is a renaissance. And carries, just as the trough carried into the millennium, a tremendous energy, so that a millennial reference wave is out of the via negativa, having its beginning of its ascent about 150 years after. The Renaissance, after about 150 years, begins to have its intensity of achieving, coming back to not only complete, but to perfect that energy sine wave frequency. And that is the new carrier wave. The traditional understanding is quite accurate. It takes about a 500-year cycle. In ancient times, it was called the Phoenix cycle. For each of those quarters in time to occur in civilization, so that the two quarters between the carrier wave and the millennium are 1,000 years. Like between the millennium and the next carrier wave, a second 1,000 years. So that a carrier wave is a double millennium, and in Greek it's called an aeon. We've talked about this. What's interesting to us is the way in which a carrier wave will have a deep ingrained memory, not only of its reference wave, but will have what could be called a lurking quality of suspicion that there's something more of the previous reference wave. Our reference wave comes from the Renaissance about 1500, from the reference wave about 1650 after that. But the millennial reference wave comes from the Via Negativa of about 500 AD, and its reference wave, the millennial reference wave, is about 650 AD. And when one looks at the tremendous impress of the Via Negativa, one comes up with a triad of conspicuous related prongs that make a kind of a pitchfork, if you will, of the goad of the way in which that energy form finds its nadir, if you like, finds its, not its lowest part, but its most invisible aspect, its most hidden aspect. And it isn't just that it's hidden so much as that it's completely unexpected from norms, from traditions, from customs. And the understanding of 500 AD goes back to the last time that there was a Via Negativa, which is about 1500 BC. And in 1500 BC, one of the most conspicuous figures, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, a couple of presentations ago, was that there was a female pharaoh in Egypt, Hatshepsut. This was her skeleton that was found in infrared about a dozen years ago. At the same time as Hatshepsut was the female pharaoh, the Rig Veda was being written in India, and you had the enormous difference. 150 years after the development of Hatshepsut came the Amarna couple of Nefertiti and her husband Akhenaten, and they became the protagonists of a one god that subsumed all of the gods of the whole mythological pantheon. And concurrent with the development of Akhenaten and Nefertiti is Moses, about 1350 BC. So that one has an enormous energy. In 500 AD, one had not only Dionysius the Areopagite that we have talked about, but you had the developments in the Dionysius the Areopagite was from the far west. In Rome, it was Boethius. And in India, it was the development of Bodhidharma, who began, in all of these cases, to make a transform of the way in which Western history, in which Asian history, in which the ancient history was being recalibrated. And along with Bodhidharma and Boethius, not just Dionysius the Areopagite, but King Arthur in Britain. And next week we'll go into the very high Dharma understanding that in the Arthurian presentation is one of the great tragic keys to the meaning of that Via Negativa that was not discovered until about 150 years after the millennium, was not recognized until then, because it had a time lag in it. And that was that the great symbol of the Arthurian integral was the round table. And the misunderstanding of the round table is still proliferating today. 12 seats at the round table and books like that. There was a 13th chair at the round table that was always left empty. It's called the seat of danger. En français, the siege perilous. It traces itself back to the realization that there is a seat in traditional synagogues that is left vacant, is left open and that is the chair of Elijah. For Elijah did not die. He was taken and he will return again. Just as King Arthur has not died dead, but is at the once and future king, the past and the future. More of this next week.